Hello and welcome to Smaulgld's U.S. Treasuries held by foreigners update for the month of November 2017. This report is timely. It's just that the U.S. Treasury does not report its holdings of foreigners of U.S. Treasuries until about, I'd say 50 days after the end of the month. So November has come out now in the middle of January. Now, Russian U.S. Treasury holdings exceed their gold holdings. We're going to talk about the holdings of Russia, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, United Kingdom today. So Russia adds to U.S. Treasuries in November, while China and Japan cut their holdings. Russian U.S. Treasury holdings are now $105.7 billion. That is near a 12-month high. Russia's gold reserves, in contrast, even after a record year in which they added well over 220 tons of gold, were valued at $76.1 billion at the end of November. That was about 1,828 tons of gold that Russia held at the end of November. They did, and we'll be reporting on this tomorrow, indeed add another 9 tons of gold in December, bringing their total up even higher. And I think their total, as of the year end, was about 77 change billion at the end of 2017. Russian U.S. Treasury holdings are up 22% over the last 12 months. They've added another 19.1 billion to their reserves, and back in November 2016, their reserves were just 86.6 billion. Chinese U.S. Treasury holdings fell in November 12.6 billion to 1.176 trillion, but they are up 127.3 billion since November 2016, when their U.S. Treasury reserves were 1.049 trillion. Japan cut U.S. Treasury holdings in November 9.9 billion, and by 24.5 billion since November 2016, when their reserves were 1.108 billion. So if you look at Japan, has steadily declined its holdings U.S. Treasuries. Back in November 2016, Japan was the #1 holder of U.S. Treasuries at 1.108, and at the time, China's was 1.049 trillion, and now China is again the largest holder of U.S. Treasuries at 1.176 trillion. Saudi Arabia, big surprise, continues to add treasuries to reserves. They had threatened to dump their treasuries over the 9/11 issue in the summer of 2016, when the 9/11 bill was passed in Congress in September of 2016, vetoed by President Obama, but then overridden by Congress. Those threats did not materialize. And indeed, since the beginning of the year, over the last 12 months, since the 9/11 bill has passed, Saudi Arabia has added close to 50% more U.S. Treasury securities to their holdings. They are now at 149 billion, up from 100.1 billion 12 months prior. And the UK has added a large amount of treasuries as well. We're going to take a look at the charts that show all of that. So the foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries over the last 12 months have increased despite the narrative that foreigners are dumping U.S. Treasuries. We have seen talk of China, perhaps, although the story was not confirmed by China, was in fact rejected, but they may slow their purchases or stop them. The story that came out never said they were going to sell them, but indeed China has sold treasuries in the past. They sold them throughout much of 2016, so it would not be unprecedented. But currently China is in the process of rebuilding her reserves. They had dipped below, at the end of 2016, under 3 trillion. They at one point had been as high as 4 trillion. They had sold them down over 2015 and 2016. And now Chinese reserves, on the strength largely of adding in the People's Bank of China's reserves, are over 3.1 trillion once again. Now, Russia is a surprise. But first of all, why are these countries that you would think would be opposed to the United States, dollar hegemony, and all this de-dollarization, why do they continue to hold treasuries? The simple fact is they are globally the most accepted, most liquid reserve you can possibly have, easy to transfer, accepted anywhere. Yes, gold serves that purpose, but gold is not as widely held. All central banks have it, but again, central banks that do hold gold They may not be adding to their gold, but no country has sold significant gold reserves over the last 10 years. We saw Britain sold some of its gold, maybe 60% of it in the early 2000s. Switzerland sold about 50% of it in order to get into the IMF back 2000s. The rest of the big holders, U.S., Germany, France, Italy, they have not added gold to their reserves in quite some time. The People's Bank of China has not reported any gold to reserves in over a year. Russia has added gold to her reserves. The Russian Central Bank, Kazakhstan, so now lately Turkey. But for the most part, gold reserves are held. They're held. They're not passed around. They're not used in trade. And I guess the dollar treasuries, if people are going to cut their reserves, they're going to cut their treasuries first before they sell any gold. But here you can see the composition of foreign reserves. Basically, it's the U.S. dollar among central banks. That's what they're going to hold. Second is euro, then pounds, then Canadian dollars, Australian dollars. They're going to hold some yen. The lowest thing they've held so far, really almost de minimis, is renminbi. Now, there has been some talk that Germany added a small amount of RMB to their reserves recently. Other countries have said they have no plans to do so. So the internationalization of the yuan to date has really been a dud. And again, it's not because China doesn't want it or China's not working on it, but they have other priorities. They need to keep their capital controls in place. They need to keep their domestic economy rolling along. And there is some distrust of the yuan in international circles. So that is held back, but that is not the number one goal of the People's Bank of China, or China's itself. The number one goal of China is basically to keep its economy rolling, to keep the growth up, to provide full employment, and not necessarily to internationalize the yuan. That would be a nice thing, but for the moment they can still print their own money, borrow against their own money, and that's basically where they are. And that's contradictory to being able to have an international currency if they know that basically you just run up your own debt and you can devalue your currency if it meets your national purpose. Now, you could say it's the same thing about the dollar. QE certainly threw the world for a loop. The dollar index fell dramatically. So when countries abuse their currencies, as China does, and that's a lot of things people don't realize, China is a very big manipulator and abuser of debt and its currency, and just as the United States has been as well, that makes other countries lose confidence in your currency. Now, interestingly enough, they're all in the same fiat game, so it's just basically whose confidence do they have the most of. And currently, right now, since they all use dollars, that's where the story is. But let's look at what Russia's been doing. Now, Russia is interesting because Russia's got an economy that's totally different than Chinese economy. Chinese economy is based on debt. It's based on exports. It's based on philosophy. It's based on now trying to switch from an export-driven economy to a service-consuming economy. So China's got a tall order. Russia's been a bit more of it's easier to track economy. It's mostly a resources economy. It's one that's not built on debt. It's export-driven on oil and very little else, and they have somewhat of a domestic economy. However, Russia has very little debt as far as central banks go. It has now rebuilt its foreign reserve position to well over $400 billion, and they'll probably get to about $500 billion. So Russia runs, as far as central banks go, a very tight ship. And this on top of the fact that they have sanctions against them, and they still have managed to keep their central bank pretty stable. And inflation is running, I think it's under double digits now. However, what's interesting is you would think that Russia, being almost a sworn enemy of many countries, including the United States, and that they have sanctions posted against them, that they would be dumping the dollar and making alternative arrangements, which they are. They're making alternative arrangements to try to reduce their dependence on dollars. They're trying to use other currencies. However, part of the prudence of the Russian central bank is to hold top-graded reserve assets, and they do that by holding gold and increasing their gold production, adding more gold as a percentage of their gold production to their reserves. But also, they have rebuilt the U.S. Treasury positions, as this chart shows. So part of any good central bank's reserve position is to have U.S. Treasuries. And what I find interesting is, in spite of the fact that they are the number one, have been adding the most gold of any nation on earth by far for the last 3 years, averaging well over 200 tons a year in 2015-16 and now 17, and now having, after December's edition, 1,838 tons of gold. They still, in dollar terms, that amount of gold is only worth about $77 billion, and Russia has $105.7 billion in U.S. Treasuries, highlighting that the dollar really is the king of the reserve game. Doesn't mean that a country or a person wouldn't rather have gold. We know that to be true if you have a choice. However, liquidity issues, if you wanted to buy $100 billion worth of gold, you're going to upset the apple cart. You're going to raise the price of the gold that you're going to buy. So it's not feasible, other than the way Russia does it, which is basically mine their own gold and then add it to reserves or run it through the Moscow exchange. But if they had to go out and buy and import that much gold, it would be counterproductive. So that's why even Russia, as the number 6 gold holding nation on earth, still has more U.S. Treasuries now than it does gold. China is even more, highlights this point even more. They have almost $1.2 trillion in U.S. Treasuries. They do not have anywhere near that amount of gold, not in the People's Bank of China, and not even if you include all the other gold that they may have in the country. That number still doesn't get you anywhere near the $1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasuries that they have. Also, China has probably a total of about $3 trillion in U.S. dollars to the various state-owned enterprises and the People's Bank of China. When we say Treasury holdings, we're only talking about those treasuries that they hold in the form of the notes or bonds, not the actual dollars that they may have on account in other places. Saudi Arabia. Now, this is another interesting one. Saudi Arabia was furious, threatened to dump its treasuries over the 9/11 bill. And as you can see here, I didn't know what changed. I know Saudi Arabia probably has twice that amount also in dollar holdings. I know, they get dollars for their oil. They may start taking other forms of payment, but it looks like they're holding and increasing their holdings in U.S. Treasuries. England was another interesting one. United Kingdom, Bank of England. Now, I just want to say this. I make a distinction when I talk about China's gold between the gold that's in China and the various places and the People's Bank of China, which is the central bank of China. I make a distinction here with the U.S. Treasury holdings. These are not the Treasury holdings held by the central banks of the countries. These are the holdings of all foreigners in these countries. So in China, when we say they hold 1.1 trillion, some of that could be at the People's Bank of China, some of that could be elsewhere in China. So when the U.S. Treasury reports on this, it is not central bank holdings. These are and that's why when you have Belgium and Ireland are in the top 5, they are not the central banks of Belgium and Ireland that hold those U.S. Treasuries. They are indeed entities that are incorporated in or located in Belgium and Ireland. So the same with Russian holdings. For the most part, the bulk of it is going to be held at the central bank, but these numbers include all holdings within the country. So United Kingdom, this would include not just the Bank of England, but probably all treasuries held in the kingdom, although Ireland, they break out separately. So, well, Ireland is separate, but like Northern Ireland would include the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, and England would be in the United Kingdom, and it would be not just the Bank of England, but also all holdings held in the United Kingdom. And as you can see, at Brexit, they had about 200 billion, and they've increased of treasuries, and they've increased their treasuries to 237 billion as of the end of November. Now that's where we are. Now we're going to have to keep track of this to see if there's any big changes coming up due to geopolitical reasons or for whatever reasons in the coming months. The Chinese threat happened in January 2018, but again, it wasn't a threat because China denied the threat, but it could have been thrown out there just on purpose. Who knows? But we won't know if there's any significant changes until probably March, April, when we get the January numbers. What we saw throughout 2017, we're still waiting on December numbers, was an increase in foreign buying of U.S. Treasuries. Now, we'll see how we do in 2018 with a lower dollar. Thank everyone for listening. Please consider donating to Smaulgld via Litecoin, Bitcoin, PayPal, or even becoming a Smaulgld patron. You can do that at the links below this BitChute, this YouTube, or on the Smaulgld site. Thank you very much for listening.